Dr. Langweiler's hands shook as he loaded the shaped charge into the crude steel tube. Behind him, 50 meters away, and crouched behind a concrete barrier, Otto and 3 other engineers watched through binoculars. "Herr Doktor," Otto's voice carried across the frozen testing ground. "Please, come back behind the barrier. Let the test dummy handle it." But Langweiler shook his head. He'd spent 2 months designing this weapon. He'd poured every ounce of genius and desperation into its creation. If it was going to fail, if it was going to explode and kill someone, it should be him, not some conscripted soldier who'd never asked to be part of this nightmare. The prototype in his hands looked absurd. A simple steel tube, barely a meter long. A bulbous warhead mounted on the front. A crude trigger mechanism. No sights worth mentioning. No safety features to speak of. The entire thing weighed less than 5 kilograms and had cost approximately 12 Reichsmarks to manufacture, about the price of a decent meal. By comparison, the American Bazooka cost nearly $200. The German Panzerschreck they'd been developing would cost even more. This weapon, this desperate improvisation, could be mass-produced by the thousands with Germany's dwindling industrial capacity. If it worked, Langweiler hoisted the tube onto his shoulder, aiming at a captured Soviet T-34 tank sitting 200 meters downrange. His finger found the trigger. He took a breath and fired. The world exploded, but not in the way anyone expected. The warhead shot forward with a shriek of propellant, trailing smoke and fire. Simultaneously, a massive jet of flame erupted from the rear of the tube, the recoilless blast that made the weapon possible. The backblast was supposed to vent safely behind the shooter. It did. The heat seared past Langweiler's face, singeing his eyebrows and filling his nostrils with the stench of burning propellant. The concussion knocked him backwards 3 steps. His ears rang like church bells. But the warhead? It flew true. 2 seconds later, the T-34 erupted in a fountain of metal and fire as the shaped charge punched through its armor like a hot knife through butter. The sound reached them a heartbeat, later a deep, satisfying boom that echoed across the testing range. Langweiler stood frozen, the empty tube smoking in his hands, his face blackened with soot, his hair standing on end. "Mein Gott!" Otto's voice sounded distant through the ringing in Langweiler's ears. "It works. It actually works." The other engineers rushed forward, shouting and slapping Langweiler on the back. But the doctor just stared at the burning tank, his mind already racing ahead to the problems. "The backblast," he muttered. "It's too much. Fire this in an enclosed space, a building, a trench, and it'll kill the shooter." But it penetrated. Otto was practically dancing. 100 millimeters of armor. This can kill anything the Soviets have. Langweiler nodded slowly, setting down the tube. His hands were still shaking, but now from adrenaline rather than fear. "Yes, it can. But we need to make it safer. Longer range. Better sights. And we need to train soldiers to never, ever fire this indoors." What Langweiler didn't say, what he was only beginning to understand, was that they'd created something unprecedented. Not just a weapon, but a new philosophy of warfare. The Americans had made a precision instrument. The Germans had made a brute force solution, crude, dangerous, barely controllable, but devastatingly effective. Within a week, the prototype had a name, Faust Patron, literally fist cartridge. Later, it would evolve into the more famous Panzerfaust, the armored fist. Within a month, the first production models were rolling out of factories in Dresden and Silesia. 12 Reichsmarks each. Simpler than a bicycle, deadlier than a cannon. Within 3 months, they arrived at the front lines. And that's when everything went wrong. June 1943, Eastern Front near Orel. Hauptmann Klaus Huber, the same officer who'd captured the original Bazooka, stood before 30 exhausted German soldiers, holding what looked like a piece of plumbing pipe with a bomb attached. "Gentlemen," he said, trying to sound confident, "this is the Panzerfaust, your new anti-tank weapon. The soldiers stared at it with the kind of skepticism that only combat veterans can muster. They'd been promised miracle weapons before. The Panzer III was supposed to be invincible. The Panzer IV was supposed to dominate the battlefield. Both had been surpassed by Soviet armor. "It looks like a toy," one soldier muttered. "It looks like a damn pipe bomb," said another. Klaus couldn't entirely disagree. Compared to the sophisticated weapons they'd trained with, the Panzerfaust looked like something a desperate partisan might cobble together in a basement. "I know it doesn't look like much," Klaus said, "but I've seen the test results. This will penetrate any Soviet tank at close range." "How close?" asked Obergefreiter Werner Schmidt, a grizzled veteran with a Knight's Cross and more tank kills than anyone in the division. 30 meters. 40 if you're lucky. The silence that followed was deafening. 30 meters? Werner's voice was deadly quiet. "Sir, with respect, 30 meters from a T-34 is suicide range. The machine guns alone will cut us down before we can aim." Klaus felt the weight of every eye on him. These men weren't cowards. They'd fought through hell itself. But they also weren't fools. "I know what I'm asking," he said quietly. "But we don't have a choice. The Panzerschreck won't arrive for months. The Panzerbuchs is useless against modern armor. This," he held up the Panzerfaust. "This is all we have." He met Werner's gaze. "The Soviets have a new offensive coming. Intelligence says 3 tank divisions. If we can't stop them, they'll roll right through us to Berlin." The truth hung in the air like smoke from a crematorium. They all knew it. Germany was losing. Resources were scarce. Men were scarcer. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder, and they were the meat. "One more thing," Klaus added, his voice harder now. "The backblast. Never fire this weapon indoors or against a wall. The blast will kill you faster than any tank. Always make sure you have clear space behind you at least 3 meters. And for God's sake, make sure no friendly soldiers are standing behind you when you fire." He handed the Panzerfaust to Werner. "You're the best anti-tank soldier I have. Show them how it's done." Werner took the weapon, feeling its crude simplicity in his hands. Light. Almost too light. For something meant to kill. A 40-ton monster. "When do we test it?" he asked. Klaus looked toward the eastern horizon, where dark smoke pillars rose like funeral pyres. "Based on the reconnaissance reports, I'd say you'll get your chance in about 6 hours." Werner nodded slowly, his jaw set. Around him, the other soldiers began checking their own Panzerfausts, their faces grim. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to fight the battle that would prove or condemn Germany's desperate gamble. A battle that would be whispered about in tank crews for the rest of the war. A battle where Werner Schmidt would do something so insane, so suicidally brave, that it would become legend. But first, the Soviet tanks had to arrive. And in the distance, growing louder with each passing minute, came the rumble of engines. Hundreds of them. The sound of mechanical death, rolling westward like an iron tide. Werner looked down at the crude pipe in his hands, then at the horizon. "Well," he muttered to himself, "let's see if German engineering beats Russian steel." He had no idea that within hours, he would answer that question in the most terrifying way possible. The frozen mud of the Eastern Front crunched beneath Hauptmann Klaus Huber's boots as he watched another Panzer IV explode in a fountain of fire and twisted metal. It was January 1943, and the German war machine, once seemingly unstoppable, was bleeding to death in the Russian winter. Klaus didn't flinch at the explosion. He'd seen too many tanks die in the past 6 months. What haunted him now was something far more terrifying. The knowledge that German soldiers were utterly helpless against Soviet armor. "Sir, that's the 3rd one today," whispered Lieutenant Friedrich Meyer, his young face pale beneath the grime and frost. "The T-34 seconds. They just keep coming." Klaus nodded grimly. He knew the statistics that kept Wehrmacht commanders awake at night. A single Soviet T-34 could shrug off most German anti-tank weapons at range. The Panzerfaust 39 anti-tank rifle? Useless. The magnetic mines? You had to get suicidally close. German infantrymen were being slaughtered trying to stop tanks with weapons that belonged to an earlier war. But Klaus had seen something the high command didn't know about yet. 3 weeks earlier, during a brutal skirmish near Kursk, Klaus's unit had overrun an American supply depot. Among the frozen bodies and scattered equipment, they'd found something extraordinary. A bazooka. The American M1 rocket launcher. Klaus had heard whispers about this weapon, how a single soldier could carry it, aim it, and punch a hole through a tank's armor from 100 meters away. The Americans called it a bazooka, after some ridiculous musical instrument. But to Klaus, it looked like salvation. He'd shipped it back to Germany immediately, marking the crate highest priority weapons development. He'd written a personal letter to anyone who would listen at the Wehrmacht's weapons testing facility in Kummersdorf. This changes everything. Study it, copy it, do whatever you must. What Klaus didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his captured bazooka was about to trigger a chain of events that would create one of the most feared anti-tank weapons of World War II. But not in the way anyone expected. 2,000 kilometers away, in a frigid laboratory at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, Dr. Heinrich Langweiler stared at the disassembled American weapons spread across his workbench like the organs of some mechanical creature. Dr. Langweiler was not a soldier. He was a 47-year-old engineer with thin wireframe glasses and hands that trembled slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. Before the war, he designed industrial machinery. Now he designed ways to kill people more efficiently. Fascinating, he muttered, picking up the bazooka's firing mechanism with a pair of tweezers. Absolutely fascinating. His assistant, a young engineer named Otto Skorzeny, no relation to the famous commando, leaned over his shoulder. "Can we copy it, Herr Doktor?" Dr. Langweiler set down the component and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This was the question that had been tormenting him for 3 days straight. Can we? Yes. Should we? That's more complicated. He gestured at the scattered components. Look at this, Otto. The Americans have created something brilliant. A reusable launcher. Precise aiming mechanisms. Electrical firing system. Rockets with fins for stability. It's elegant. It's effective. It's expensive. Otto finished. Exactly. Dr. Langweiler walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered testing range. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of artillery practice, the sound of Germany's dwindling resources being consumed by an endless war. Here's what the Americans don't understand about this war, Otto. They have factories that stretch from coast to coast. They have resources we can only dream of. They can afford to build complex, reusable weapons for every soldier. But us? He turned back, his eyes hard behind those thin spectacles. We're running out of everything. Steel, copper, time, men. Otto frowned. So we can't build it? Oh, we can build it. We've already been working on our own design, the Panzerschreck. Bigger than the bazooka, more powerful. But that's not what Berlin wants. He picked up a telegram that had arrived that morning, reading it aloud. Need immediate solution. Cheap. Mass-producible. Effective. Soldiers dying daily to enemy armor. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that telegram pressing down on them like the winter snow on the roof. Then Dr. Langweiler said something that would change the course of the war. What if we're thinking about this wrong? What if we don't need it to be reusable at all? Otto's eyes widened. A disposable weapon? Why not? Look at this. Dr. Langweiler grabbed a piece of chalk and began sketching frantically on a blackboard. The expensive parts of the bazooka, the electrical system, the aiming mechanism, the durable launcher tube. What if we eliminate all of that? What if we make something so cheap, so simple, that a soldier fires it once and throws it away? But the warhead, make it part of the weapon. A shaped charge, like we've been developing. Powerful enough to penetrate any tank. Mount it on a simple steel tube. Use a basic recoilless system to handle the blast. No electricity. No complexity. Just point and fire. Otto was already catching the vision, his voice rising with excitement. We could manufacture thousands of them. Every soldier could carry one. Exactly. The Americans created a rifle for tank hunting. We'll create a hand grenade that can shoot across a street. Dr. Langweiler stared at his rough sketch. It looked crude, almost primitive compared to the sophisticated American weapon on the workbench. But sometimes he realized the crude solution was the right solution. Get me the shaped charge team, he said quietly, and find me the cheapest steel tubing in Germany. We're going to turn necessity into a virtue. Neither man knew it yet, but they had just conceived the Panzerfaust, literally armored fist in German, a weapon so simple a child could use it, so cheap it cost less than a soldier's boots, so effective it would destroy thousands of Allied tanks. And it all started because they looked at an American bazooka and decided to do exactly the opposite. But the real story, the shocking twists, the desperate battles, the weapon that would make tank crews weep with fear, that story was only just beginning. The T-34 seconds appeared at dawn, emerging from the morning mist like prehistoric monsters rising from a primordial swamp. Werner Schmidt pressed himself against the cold earth at the edge of a destroyed Russian village, watching through his binoculars as the Soviet armor rolled forward. He counted 12 tanks in the first wave. Behind them, he could see at least 20 more, and behind those, the dark shapes of infantry carriers. Mein Gott, whispered the young soldier beside him, a boy named Hans, barely 19 years old. So many. Werner lowered the binoculars and looked at the Panzerfaust lying in the dirt beside him. In the pale morning light, it looked even more pathetic than it had the night before. A pipe with a bomb. That's all it was. Behind them, Hauptmann Klaus Huber was positioning the defense. 30 men armed with these crude weapons. 30 men against a Soviet armored division. The mathematics of death. Werner thought bitterly. Listen to me, Werner said quietly to Hans and the 3 other soldiers in his position. When they come, let them get close. I know every instinct in your body will scream to fire early. Don't. If you fire at 50 meters, you'll probably miss. If you fire at 20 meters, you'll probably die before you can aim. 30 meters. That's the sweet spot. How will we know when it's 30 meters? Hans asked, his voice trembling. Werner pointed to a burned-out fence post. See that marker? When the tank passes it, that's 30 meters. That's when you fire. He met each soldier's eyes in turn. 1 shot. That's all you get. Make it count. The tanks were closer now. Werner could hear the distinctive grinding of their treads, the roar of their engines, the sound that had haunted Wehrmacht soldiers' nightmares for 2 years. And remember, Werner added, check behind you before you fire. The backblast will kill anyone standing there, just as dead as the warhead will kill the tank. The ground began to vibrate. That's how close they were now. Klaus appeared in their trench, crouching low. Werner, they're going to pass right through the village center. I need you to do something insane. Werner looked at his commander. More insane than facing tanks with pipe bombs? I need you to get to that building. Klaus pointed to a 3-story structure in the village center, miraculously still standing. 2nd floor, western window. When the tanks enter the square, you'll have a clear shot at their side armor. It's thinner there. Werner stared at the building, then at the approaching tanks, calculating angles and distances. That's not 30 meters, sir. That's more like 15. I know. At 15 meters, if I miss, they'll know exactly where I am. That building will become rubble in seconds. I know that too. Klaus's voice was steady. But if you hit the lead tank in the square, it'll block the others. Create a bottleneck. Give our other positions a chance. Werner was silent for a moment. Then he picked up his Panzerfaust and a second one lying nearby. If I'm going to commit suicide, might as well have a backup. Klaus gripped his shoulder. For what it's worth, if anyone can make this shot, it's you. And if I can't, then I'll have a very short report to write about how we tried to stop them. Werner laughed a short, bitter bark of sound. Then he was moving, sprinting in a low crouch toward the building. The two Panzerfausts clutched against his chest. The stairs inside the building were partially collapsed, but Werner climbed them anyway, his heart hammering. He reached the second floor and moved to the western window, looking down at the village square below. Perfect killing ground. The Soviets would have to funnel through here to reach the German positions beyond. Werner set down both weapons and took several deep breaths, trying to slow his racing heart. Through the broken window, he could see the lead T-34 approaching the square, its turrets swiveling left and right, hunting for targets. Behind it, 11 more tanks followed in a loose formation. Werner's hands were steady as he lifted the first Panzerfaust to his shoulder. He'd killed 7 tanks in his career, 3 with magnetic mines, 2 with artillery coordination, 2 with the old anti-tank rifle before it became obsolete. Each time, he'd nearly died. This would be different. This was personal. Just him. A crude weapon. And a 40-ton monster. The T-34 entered the square. Werner waited. It rolled forward, closer, its commander visible in the open hatch, scanning for threats. 20 meters. Werner's finger found the trigger, but he held steady. Not yet. 15 meters. The tank was so close Werner could see the Cyrillic letters painted on its side. Could see the mud caked on its treads. Could hear the radio chatter from inside. He aimed for a spot just below the turret where the side armor met the hull. The weakest point. And fired. The backblast was catastrophic in the enclosed space. The window frame exploded outward. The wall behind Werner cracked. His ears went instantly deaf, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that felt like an ice pick through his skull. But the warhead flew true. The shaped charge struck the T-34's side armor and detonated with a sound like the world ending. The jet of superheated metal punched through the armor, through the ammunition storage inside, through the hull, and out the other side. For one frozen moment, nothing happened. Then, the T-34 erupted from within. The explosion lifted the turret off its base like a champagne cork, sending it spinning 20 meters into the air. Fire and smoke blasted from every hatch and viewport. The ammunition cooked off in a chain reaction that sounded like a string of firecrackers made by a mad god. The tank lurched to a stop, completely blocking the square's entrance, its hull already beginning to glow cherry red from the inferno inside. Werner didn't wait to admire his work. He grabbed the second Panzerfaust, moved to a different window. The first was now wreathed in smoke and flames from his own backblast and aimed at the second tank. The Soviet commander, seeing his lead tank die, was desperately trying to reverse, but the village streets were too narrow, the formation too tight. Werner fired again. This time, the backblast actually knocked him off his feet, slamming him against the far wall. But through the smoke and chaos, he saw the second tank shudder and die, flames erupting from its engine compartment. 2 tanks, dead, blocking the square like tombstones. The remaining Soviet tanks opened fire on the building. The world became sound and fury. Shells smashed into the structure, tearing away chunks of masonry. The floor beneath Werner tilted at a crazy angle. Dust and debris filled the air like a blizzard. Werner scrambled for the stairs, half climbing, half falling down to the ground floor as the building began to collapse behind him. He burst out into the street, just as the third floor crashed down where he'd been standing seconds before. But he was laughing like a madman, because in the square behind him, 2 T-34 seconds burned like funeral pyres, and the Soviet advance had stopped, actually stopped. The other tanks were trying to maneuver around the wrecks, but the narrow streets made it impossible. They were bunched up, confused, exposed, and all around the village, Werner could hear it, the distinctive whoosh boom of Panzerfausts firing. His fellow soldiers, emboldened by his success, were engaging at close range. Another tank exploded. Then, another. Klaus found Werner in the rubble, covered in dust and blood from a dozen small cuts, his hair singed, his face blackened with soot. "Werner, you magnificent bastard," Klaus breathed. "You actually did it." Werner looked at his commander, his ears still ringing, and said something he'd never expected to say. "Sir?" I want more of those weapons. As many as we can get. By sunset, 12 Soviet T-34 seconds lay destroyed in and around the village. The Germans had lost 7 men. 7 against an armored division. The impossible had happened. Infantry mere foot soldiers armed with 12 Reichsmark pipe bombs had defeated Soviet armor. The after-action report from that battle reached Berlin within 48 hours. It landed on desks at the Wehrmacht High Command, at the Weapons Development Office, at Hitler's own headquarters. The message was simple, but it changed everything. Panzerfaust effective beyond expectations. Request immediate mass production. Within weeks, factories across Germany were retooled. Production ramped up from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. The weapon evolved longer-range variants, better sights, improved warheads. But the core concept remained. Cheap, simple, disposable, deadly. By 1944, Germany was producing Panzerfausts at a rate of 1 million per month. Soviet tank commanders began to fear German infantry more than German tanks. Allied forces advancing through France and Belgium learned to dread the sound of that distinctive whoosh from a darkened window or hidden foxhole. Werner Schmidt survived the war. Hauptmann Klaus Huber did not defending. He died defending Berlin in 1945. A Panzerfaust in his hands. Dr. Langweiler lived to see peacetime, haunted by what he'd created. And somewhere in the ruins of that Russian village, the burned-out hulks of 2 T-34 seconds remained for decades, silent monuments to the day a desperate improvisation became a weapon of legend. Dr. Heinrich Langweiler stood in his office, staring at a map of Europe that grew smaller with each passing week. Red pins marked Soviet positions advancing from the east. Blue pins marked American and British forces closing from the west. The space between them, the space still colored in German black, was shrinking like a dying star. On his desk lay the latest production reports. Since that battle near Orel 18 months ago, Germany had manufactured over 6 million Panzerfausts. 6 million disposable tank killers, distributed to Wehrmacht soldiers, Volkssturm militia, even Hitler Youth, in the desperate final defense of the Reich. The weapon had evolved. The Panzerfaust 30 had become the Panzerfaust 60, with double the range. Then came the Panzerfaust 100, and finally the Panzerfaust 150, which could strike targets at 150 meters with devastating accuracy. They'd added simple but effective sights, improved the warhead, made the weapon more reliable, more deadly. But none of that changed the fundamental truth. Germany was still losing. Herr Doktor? Otto entered, older now, his youthful enthusiasm worn away by years of war. The evacuation orders have come. We're to destroy all research and retreat west. Langweiler nodded slowly, picking up the original sketch he'd made that day in 1943. The crude drawing of a tube with a warhead, born from studying the American bazooka and deciding to do exactly the opposite. Do you ever wonder, Otto, if we created a monster? Otto was quiet for a moment. It saved German lives, Herr Doktor. That's what weapons are supposed to do. Did it? Or did it just prolong the inevitable? How many boys' children really died holding these things in the last days of Berlin, convinced they could stop Soviet tanks with a pipe bomb? There was no good answer to that question. But Langweiler knew the numbers, knew them intimately, because they haunted his dreams. The Panzerfaust had destroyed an estimated 20,000 Allied and Soviet tanks during the war. 20,000, each one containing 3 to 5 men. Each one representing hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks in enemy resources destroyed by a weapon that cost less than a pair of boots. From a purely military standpoint, it was the most cost-effective weapon ever created. From a human standpoint, it was something else entirely. Come, Langweiler said finally, let's burn the research and go home, if home still exists. But here's the shocking truth that Dr. Langweiler never lived to fully understand. The Panzerfaust didn't just destroy tanks. It destroyed a military philosophy that had stood for centuries. The revolution no one saw coming. For thousands of years of warfare, there was an absolute truth. Heavy armor beats light infantry. The man in the metal always defeats the man with the spear. The knight destroys the peasant. The tank obliterates the foot soldier. The Panzerfaust shattered that truth forever. Suddenly, a single soldier, poorly trained, poorly equipped, costing almost nothing to arm, could destroy a tank that required years of industrial capacity and highly trained crews to produce. The economics of warfare inverted overnight. The Americans and Soviets studied captured Panzerfausts with the same intensity the Germans had studied the Bazooka. They saw immediately what had changed. The Americans went on to develop the M72 Law, light anti-tank weapon, a direct descendant of the Panzerfaust philosophy. Cheap, disposable, effective. The Soviets created the RPG series rocket-propelled grenades, which would become perhaps the most prolific infantry weapon in history. Over 9 million RPG 7 seconds have been manufactured since 1961, and they're still in use today, still destroying multi-million-dollar vehicles with weapons that cost a few $100s. The British developed the N-Law. The French created the Apilles. The Israelis made the B-300. Every modern military on Earth now arms its infantry with descendants of that crude German pipe bomb. But the true legacy goes deeper than just the weapons themselves. The hidden truth. Here's what the history books rarely tell you. The captured American bazooka that started this entire chain of events? It was found by accident. Hauptmann Klaus Huber wasn't on a special mission to capture American weapons technology. He stumbled across it during a routine engagement. One abandoned weapon. One curious German officer. One engineer, willing to think backwards. That's all it took to change warfare forever. If Klaus had walked past that supply depot, if Dr. Langweiler had simply tried to copy the bazooka instead of reimagining it, if Werner Schmidt had refused to make that impossible shot, the entire history of modern infantry warfare might be different. The Panzerfaust proved something terrifying. In war, desperation breeds innovation. When you strip away resources, when you remove options, when you face impossible odds, that's when human ingenuity becomes most dangerous. Germany created the Panzerfaust not because they were winning, but because they were losing. They made it cheap, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. They made it simple not by choice, but by necessity. And in doing so, they accidentally demonstrated that sometimes the crude solution is superior to the elegant one. Sometimes good enough for one use beats perfect and reusable. Sometimes you win by zigging when everyone else zags. The final irony. In the bunkers beneath Berlin in April 1945, as Soviet tanks rolled through the streets above, teenage boys from the Hitler Youth crouched in rubble with Panzerfausts, believing they could still turn the tide of the war. They couldn't, of course. Germany had already lost. But here's the thing that still sends chills down the spines of military historians. Those boys destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks. Dozens. In the apocalyptic final battle for Berlin, the Panzerfaust was one of the few German weapons that still worked, that still killed, that still mattered. The Americans found Dr. Langweiler in 1946, living in a bombed-out apartment in Hamburg. They interviewed him extensively, documenting every detail of the Panzerfaust development. His notes, his calculations, his philosophy of elegant simplicity through desperate necessity, all of it was studied and absorbed into American weapons development. He died in 1953, never knowing that his creation would spawn an entire category of weapons that would define military conflicts for the next 70 years and counting. Hauptmann Klaus Huber's grave was never found. He likely died in the rubble of Berlin, fighting to the end. But Werner Schmidt, the man who made that impossible shot, who proved the Panzerfaust could work, he lived to see reunified Germany. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he said something that should make us all pause. We were given a weapon that made us feel powerful, that made us believe we could win battles we had already lost. That's the real danger of effective weapons. They make you forget that war itself is the problem, not the solution. The world today, right now, at this very moment, somewhere in the world, A soldier is holding a modern anti-tank weapon, an RPG, a law, a javelin, a NEN-law that exists because German engineers disassembled an American bazooka and decided to do exactly the opposite of what they found. Every guerrilla fighter who's ever destroyed a tank with an RPG-7 is using the philosophical descendant of the Panzerfaust. Every asymmetric warfare conflict, every insurgency that uses cheap weapons to destroy expensive vehicles, is following the playbook that was accidentally written in a frozen German laboratory in 1943. The Panzerfaust demonstrated that you don't need to match your enemy's industrial capacity. You just need to think differently. It's estimated that descendants of the Panzerfaust have destroyed over 100,000 armored vehicles since World War II. That's 100,000 tanks, APCs, and fighting vehicles representing trillions of dollars in military hardware destroyed by weapons that, in most cases, cost less than a smartphone. The economic implications alone have reshaped how nations think about warfare. Why build an expensive tank that can be destroyed by a cheap rocket? Why invest billions in armor when a soldier with a week of training can negate that advantage? These questions, born from a desperate German innovation, continue to haunt military planners today. The last word. So here's the truth about the Panzerfaust. It was never supposed to exist. It was created by necessity, refined through desperation, and proved effective through suicidal courage. It was a weapon that should have been a footnote in history, a crude improvisation by a losing side. Instead, it became the template for modern infantry anti-tank warfare. And it all started because German soldiers disassembled an American bazooka and accidentally gave birth to something far more revolutionary than anyone intended. In war, as in life, sometimes the biggest changes come not from perfecting what already exists, but from desperately improvising something entirely new. The Panzerfaust wasn't better than the bazooka in most technical ways. It was shorter ranged, less accurate, more dangerous to the user, and couldn't be reused. But it could be everywhere, in every soldier's hands, in every battle, at every critical moment. And in the end, everywhere beat better. That's the legacy of the Panzerfaust. That's the lesson that echoes through military history. And that's why, 80 years later, when military engineers design infantry weapons, they still ask themselves the same question. Dr. Langweiler asked that cold day in 1943. What if we're thinking about this wrong? Sometimes the answer to that question changes everything.